Hi, this is another issue or installment of the Bible Interpreversity, where I am teaching you how to study the Bible on your own, telling you about principles and methods so that you can not only learn from other people, but you can study the Bible yourself. Today I'm going to be in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, which says, "And into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you." Now, this is obviously the continue of a previous sentence, and so if you're going to understand this correctly, you have to know what the previous sentence says. That's a pretty important principle of Bible interpretation and Bible study. The sentence started at the beginning of verse 3, which goes like this: "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ." There's one sentence. Now here's the next sentence. "In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade." So there you have those two ends, the conjunctions, the intos, into a living hope and into an inheritance. So what we're talking about is the new birth. Therefore, what we're talking about is salvation. Let's look at it again. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. So that's what that's what this inheritance is all about. The inheritance obviously pertains to salvation, which pertains to the new birth. And we talked about that last time. So let's move on to what's going on here. Because he says, into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. And then he talks about the inheritance a little bit. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you. So let's talk about what is kept in heaven for us. The language is pretty clear that what is kept in heaven for us is the inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. That has to do with the new birth. So it's a new birth into a living hope, and it's a new birth into an inheritance. Now, if you want to know what inheritance is all about, since we said what this is this inheritance is being kept in heaven for you, which is our living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead into an inheritance. And so if you want to know what this inheritance is referring to, we have to understand, what did it mean to them? We know what inheritance means to us in our world, but how do we find out what it meant to them? And that's where it helps to read a couple of commentaries. You can find some commentaries online. You can certainly buy commentaries in the store. But if you read commentaries, you find out that inheritance in their day did not only pertain to a future endowment, but it also pertained to something that you held securely now. It was your inheritance, even though you haven't inherited it yet. It's a secure possession that is part of your possession now and part of an endowment for the future. Let me read a note of something I perceived. See, this inheritance, since we're talking about salvation and since we're talking about new hope, see, we're trying to bring all the thoughts together if we interpret the Bible correctly. See, it's the final participation in all things God. That's what our new hope, based on the resurrection of the dead and the new birth into a living hope and into an inheritance. In the inheritance, we gain access to the full presence of God, the full benefits of belonging to his covenant people, and the full reception and culmination of all these blessings that are available to us as believers. When we put together all the pieces in the New Testament that speak of our spiritual inheritance, it mostly refers to coming to the point for which we were created. It's the blessing of the new birth, the new hope, and a full participation in all things God. Now, I happen to have on my shelves another book by a woman named Sarah Rudin, who wrote an excellent book called Paul Among the People. I would actually recommend that book to you. But she brings a little bit of a different understanding to it, because inheritance in the ancient world meant something a little bit different. I'll just quote a few things that she said. I won't read it in its entirety. But she says, for the ancient people, meaning Roman Empire, inheritance was the defining fact for secure, respectable people. But for slaves, for freedmen, for laborers, for soldiers, wanderers, colonists, hucksters, prostitutes, artists, entrepreneurs, there was no such thing as inheritance. Inheritance was only for the wealthy classes. It was only those who were part of those classes that ever had any hope of what the others would consider to be a fantasy of ever inheriting anything. Now let me read this paragraph because I think it's really helpful to our understanding. Christianity offered anyone and everyone who would come to Jesus, no matter how poor or powerless, an alternative, an actual inheritance, another kind of home, a new way to belong. That ties in with new birth and a new hope. In this light, Paul's message is strongly positive, not obey these strictures against human nature or we'll kick you out of the community you were born into, but instead, we offer you an equal share of a community, such as most of you would never even dream of before. You forfeit it only if you are disorderly through these destructive acts that are not even attractive in comparison to the life you could be leading. Interesting, this inheritance is something that most people in their day didn't even dream of. And then she concludes with, no wonder Christianity grew like mad. It was not only a future endowment, it was a secure possession. And it was not only a secure possession, it was a means of belonging that most people in their world didn't even dream of. Then he defines this inheritance with three words that all begin with A in the Greek. In the English, they don't. But this inheritance that can never perish, that can never spoil, that can never fade. When we're studying the Bible, when you see this, it's like, oh, helps us understand. He's putting these three parts in what this inheritance all about. So let's look at these. This inheritance can never perish. Now, there must be a reason he says that. And yeah, do you remember the story of the prodigal son, where the boy went out and spent his inheritance and it was gone? Sometimes parents spend an inheritance. We are even right now spending our children's inheritance and glad about it. Sometimes armies can come and take away your inheritance. Sometimes thieves can come in and break in and steal. But what Peter is saying here is that the inheritance that you have in Jesus Christ can never perish. Now, to me, this statement has so much gravity. What God gives us, see, this is where you just have to think about what the text says if you're going to interpret it properly. What God gives cannot be lost. It cannot be destroyed. It will not go away. This inheritance can never perish. It is settled. It is secure. Now, so many parts of life, as you know, are wisps in the wind. They seem to be solid, but they can go away. We look at all the wildfires out in the west of America, and everything people has is gone. And one day you have it, the next day you don't. So we work to maintain our finances, and we exercise, and we try to eat right, and we take medicines to try to maintain our health. and we carefully monitor our reputation and our image and our integrity. Yet at the same time, we're all anxious and we're sometimes afraid because we know how quickly this can all collapse or disappear. And so the idea that we can have an inheritance that will never perish, that it's incorruptible, that it's indestructible, that it's immortal, that it can never be troubled by anxiety or fear, this is priceless. No wonder Peter talks about it. Then he goes on to his second statement, that it can never spoil. Okay, well, so think about that. Not only is the inheritance indestructible, but it can't even be polluted. It can't be corrupted. It can't be spoiled, right? Now, remember, they did not live in an era where there was refrigeration. Food would spoil if they didn't eat it. Food would quickly spoil. But remember also the story of Job, where in Job, the accuser was not allowed to take his life, but he was given permission to ruin his life and to take everything away. It's hard to know which was worse. But this inheritance that we have in Christ is incapable of pollution. It's impervious to ruin. It's stain-proof. It cannot spoil. This is profound. The third thing he says is that this inheritance can never fade. All right. Not only will our inheritance never wither on its own, it has staying power. It's fine. It's indestructible. It's unpollutable. But maybe it will run its course. When people talk to me online, they say things like, well, don't you think you'll get tired of heaven? Don't you think you'll grow weary of the whatever it is that is there? And I say, and the idea is here, no. Peter is saying that this inheritance, our salvation, our present reality and future hope, will never lose its luster. It will never run out of steam. It will never become boring in the course of time. It will not happen, says Peter. And then he says, this inheritance is kept in heaven for you. Well, what does that mean, and how do we know? So if you go to thebible.org, thebible.org, and go to this verse, 1 Peter 1:4, you can see what that word keep or kept means. You can read the translation there, and what it means is that it's safeguarded, that it is preserved. As Peter has already said, it can't perish, it can't spoil, it can't fade. It is being preserved in the state that it's in. So this inheritance, when you think about that, it's locked. It's locked in the most secure and invulnerable place. It's kept in heaven for you. Apart from any wickedness or weaknesses or problems of this world, it's kept in heaven. It's out of the reach of sin. It's out of the reach of mortality, out of the reach of corruption, and even of temporality. Peter can hardly cluster up any more terms to assure us of the beauty and wonder and marvel and security and permanence of this new birth and God's adoption of us. And then he says it's kept in heaven for us. Now, there's an interesting comment by N.T. Wright about this that I just want to share with you. He says, this does not mean heaven when we think of pearly gates and golden streets. When he says it's kept in heaven for you, it doesn't mean that there's a safety deposit box in heaven where your salvation is being kept. N.T. Wright says it's a reverent way of speaking about God. He's talking about the place where God's purposes for the future are stored up and secured. In other words, as Jesus said in the Gospels, that God holds you in his hand, and what is in his hand cannot be taken from God's hand. This is the same kind of thought. God is guarding our inheritance for us. And who's going to be able to take it away from God? Nobody can. That's Peter's point. It is secured in heaven for you. And then if you just think about that last line, that it's for you. It's for you. All this is done for you. We are the objects of God's love. We are the desired relationship. We are the targets of God's care. See, we are the beneficiaries of God's security. It's a beautiful verse.